Hello again. When I did a bit on the Empire Windrush the other day, a number of people remarked in the comments that it was ironic that Enoch Powell, famous for his Rivers of Blood speech of course, had actually been one of those who tried to lure West Indian immigrants to Britain in the first place. This old myth may be found everywhere, even though there's not a word of truth in it. I've even seen mention on a Caribbean website of the idea that Powell actually visited Jamaica to make a recruiting speech for the National Health Service. This is all really strange because neither Enoch Powell nor anybody else connected with any British government was trying to get people to come and live permanently in Britain by working for the NHS in the early 1960s when he was a minister. The whole thing is an invention. It's true that in the 1950s the NHS wanted nurses to come from the islands of the Caribbean to train in Britain and gain practical experience. The plan was, though, that they would then return to their own countries, which would benefit from the training which they'd received in this country. At the same time, the 5 years or so that they would be learning on the job in British hospitals would provide extra staff for the NHS, which was struggling a bit at that time in the years immediately following its establishment. This, of course, was nothing at all to do with Enoch Powell, who was for part of that time a backbencher and for a few years Financial Secretary to the Treasury. In 1960, Enoch Powell was appointed Minister of Health, which is what we now call the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. He held this post first under Macmillan, but he resigned in 1963 when Alec Douglas-Home became Prime Minister. By that time, the NHS was no longer involved in persuading people from the Caribbean to come and train as nurses in Britain. Individual health authorities had been given responsibility for recruiting staff, and it was not done either by the NHS as a whole, nor did it have anything at all to do with the government. Even had he wanted to bring hospital staff to Britain, Powell would have had no authority to do so, or even say anything at all on the subject. From time to time, the Ministry of Health would, when asked, say something vague about the contribution made by nurses from the West Indies, but they were certainly not being encouraged to come to Britain by the ministry or any other government department. Powell himself was not enthusiastic about health workers coming from the Caribbean and tried to ensure that where possible they returned to their own countries after training or working in Britain. How did the legend about Enoch Powell recruiting staff for the Caribbean begin? It was certainly around very soon after the so-called Rivers of Blood speech, which Enoch Powell made in 1968. I first heard the idea mentioned it can't have been any later than 1970, and by that time it was treated as fact and nobody questioned it. I suppose it's such a marvellous and ironic idea that it was too good not to repeat. Just imagine that famous racist had been responsible for immigration from the West Indies. Talking of racism leads me to the other old legend about Enoch Powell, that he was racially prejudiced. This idea is so ingrained today that it's hard to get younger people to understand that it's nonsense. I don't bother personally to try and correct this misunderstanding. It's not worth it. Powell disapproved of immigration not because he was a racist, but because he thought that a homogeneous society where everybody shared common values and beliefs was good for democracy. I happen to think that he was right. When he was in the army in India during the Second World War, Enoch Powell had various Indian friends, and he taught himself Urdu so that he could get on with them better. After 1945, he had to travel around India because he was, by the way, the youngest Brigadier General in the British Army. He was also Secretary of the All Indian Army Committee, and the idea was that preparations were being made for independence. He was travelling in early 1946 with an Indian officer called General Kodandera Madappa Karyappa, who later, by the way, became Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army after independence. The two men went into the Bicolour Club in Pune, which was for white officers, and Powell was told discreetly that they wouldn't serve General Cariappa because he wasn't white. Powell was absolutely furious, and although he was supposed to be staying the night there at that particular club, he told them to fetch his luggage because he would instead be staying with his friend General Cariappa, which he did. He had no use at all for racial prejudice. Later on, when Cariappa was Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, he visited England, went to visit Enoch Powell, who he regarded as a friend, and he and Powell and his wife went out for dinner together. This is the man who is now called a racist. When somebody asked about this idea after his famous speech in 1968, Powell said that, if anything, he thought that Indians were superior to white Europeans. That's some strange sort of racist.